Katsuyori stood on the slopes of Mount Tenmokuzan and watched as his last loyal men fought against all odds to protect their lord. Even his young wife had taken arms at one point. His father, Shingen, had managed to beat Ieyasu to make him cower within his castle's walls. But after 7 years of war, here he was, cornered in a remote mountain pass, with no allies left and facing certain death. His mind raced back to that fateful day at Nagashino and thought of what might have been. Welcome back to another episode of our series on the Sengoku Jidai, and the third on Tokugawa Ieyasu. In this episode, we will cover one of the most famous clashes of the Sengoku era, the Battle of Nagashino, in which we will see firearms bludgeon the famous Takeda cavalry, tragedy strike the house of Ieyasu, and the downfall and last stand of the Takeda at Tenmokuzan. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. The war with the Takeda clan did not stop with Shingen's passing. A year after his death, Takeda Katsuyori, who had succeeded his father as head of the clan, invaded Mikawa. In June, he laid siege to the castle of Nagashino, whose defences were commanded by Okudaira Sedamasa. Katsuyori's campaign had started with the best omens, for he had even secured the assistance of Oga Yashiro, the Daikan of Mikawa, who was in charge of financial matters in the area and wielded significant authority. Yashiro's arrogance made him turn traitor towards Ieyasu, and he offered to help Katsuyori should he invade Mikawa by opening the gates of Okazaki Castle. Thus bolstered by this turn of events, Katsuyori marched into Ieyasu's land. Unbeknownst to him, Yashiro's betrayal had been discovered, and he and his family had been captured and had met a very gruesome end. Despite taking care of the traitorous Yashiro, Ieyasu knew that he could not take on the larger Takeda force alone, and so sent for Oda Nobunaga, who resided at Gifu, to assist him. Meanwhile, the situation at Nagashino was getting more dire by the day. Katsuyori's frontal assaults against the castle's walls had failed, but food was running out fast, and Sadamasa's men wouldn't be able to hold much more after that. This was the message Torii Tsunemon, one of the castle's defenders, brought to Ieyasu after slipping past the Takeda lines one night. Tsunemon then made the return journey, carrying with him the promises of both Ieyasu and Nobunaga that they would make haste to relieve the siege. Unfortunately, this time he was captured by the Takeda soldiers, who became aware that someone had escaped the castle and tightened their defences. Katsuyori offered a deal to Tsunemon, his life in exchange for aid in deceiving the castle's garrison into believing that no help was coming and they should surrender. However, when Tsunemon stood outside the walls, he shouted that their lord was coming to relieve the siege. As punishment for this brave act and firm loyalty to Ieyasu, Tsunemon was crucified by the Takeda. With little hope of capturing the castle before the combined Oda-Tokugawa armies would reach him, Katsuyori held a war council with his generals. The older and wiser of them opted for a retreat back into Kai, but Katsuyori and the younger generals wanted to stay and fight, and so it was decided that they would give battle there. Staying true to their promise, Nobunaga and Ieyasu arrived on the evening of the 27th, 6 miles west of Nagashino at Shidahara with a combined force of 38,000 men. They quickly took up positions on the ridgeline behind a small stream called Ringogawa as a countermeasure to the feared Takeda cavalry. Seeking to provide further protection for his arquebusiers, Nobunaga ordered the construction of a palisade with a few gaps here and there so as to allow possible counterattacks. His plan was to use rotating volleys of arquebus fire to decimate the Takeda's famed cavalry charge, while his spearmen would protect the missile troops. On the dawn of the 28th, the Allied battle line stood as follows: The extreme right flank of the Tokugawa army was secured by 1,000 men, led by Okubo Tadao. His position was the only one not covered by the fence, but instead was only protected by some trees. Next to him were Osuka Yasutaka and Sakakibara Yasumasa, each in charge of 1,000 men as well. Next in line was the warrior who surpassed death itself, the famous Honda Tadaketsu, who was leading a similarly sized regiment, while behind him stood his daimyo, Tokugawa Ieyasu, with 2,000 men. On the left flank of the Tokugawa forces, close to the center of the overall line, were Ishikawa Kazumasa and Torii Mototada, with 1,800 respectively, while behind them was Ieyasu's son Nobuyasu, in command of 1,000 soldiers. Next to Torii stood the first Oda contingent under Takigawa Kazumatsu. On his left, occupying the center of the Oda forces, was Nobunaga's star general Hashiba Hideyoshi, who had the honor of guarding his lord, who had placed his headquarters behind him. Next along were Niue Nagahide and Mizuno Nobumoto, while the rear was supported by Sakuma Nobumori. On the other side of the Rengogawa, Katsuyori split his army into 5 divisions, each numbering 3,000 men. One was left to continue the siege on the castle, and another would serve as reserves under his personal command. On the right flank was Baba Nobuharu, in the center was Naito Kiyonaga, and Yamagata Masakage was on the left flank. At around 6 AM, the Takeda cavalry charged towards the entrenched allied positions, Masakage's contingent being the first to make contact, with the other generals following suit. Yet every attack had the same bloody fate, as Nobunaga's gunners mowed down Japan's finest cavalry with alternating volleys, though some modern scholars dispute this and argue that the Oda arquebusiers discharged their guns en masse instead. Those who escaped the bullets found themselves against a hail of blades from Oda and Tokugawa spearmen. On the Takeda right flank, Baba Nobuharu had made some progress, but was then met by a detachment led by Shibata Katsuie and Hashiba Hideyoshi. While the fight raged on the banks of the Rengogawa River, Sekai Tadatsugu with 3,500 men attacked the Takeda forces who were still at Nagashino. They had secretly moved during the night and approached the besiegers from the rear. Watching Tadatsugu's assault from the walls of Nagashino, Okudaira Sadamasa gave the order for the garrison to sally out, and despite being weakened from hunger and illness, they inflicted great damage to the Takeda troops. Back at Shidarahara, Katsuyori decided to fully commit, ordering a general attack and throwing in the last of his reserves. Yet even these fresh troops weren't able to dislodge the Oda Ashigaru from their defenses. The bloody struggle between the two forces continued until 1 hour after noon, when Nobunaga gave the order for the Oda troops to fall back on the fences. This was the opportunity the battered Takeda soldiers waited for, and retreated on the road back towards Kai. Seeing this action, Nobunaga changed his orders, now shouting to his men to pursue their opponents. This they did, slaughtering and capturing many of the Takeda, some of which were prominent samurai. In total, around 10,000 heads were taken that day by the Oda men. Among the dead were some of the most notable Takeda leaders, like Baba Nobuharu, Naito Kiyonaga, the Sanada brothers, and Yamagata Masakage.
Nagashino was a great victory for the Oda Tokugawa side, and gave Ieyasu plenty of breathing room, allowing him to go on the offensive and capture many fortresses. Though significantly weakened, Katsuyori and the Takeda were far from falling, and 7 more years of fighting awaited Ieyasu before he would finally be able to put down his opponent. Things were going well for Ieyasu, or at least seemed to be, as he had prevailed in Nagashino against the mighty Takeda clan, which, even without Shingen's leadership, was a formidable foe. However, the war was not yet over. Each side often conducted raids into the other's territory, but each time they retreated back without giving a decisive battle. It was during this time that tragedy struck Ieyasu's own household, with the cause being none other than his own wife. As we saw in the previous episodes about Ieyasu's life, his first wife, Lady Tsukiyama, was related to the Imagawa clan. Her husband's actions against Ujizane had cost her her father's life, something she never truly forgave him for. The chasm between the couple deepened after 1570, when Ieyasu relocated his quarters to Hamamatsu, while she remained behind in Okazaki, where her son Nobuyasu and his wife also resided. In her absence, Ieyasu would not remain faithful. It was not uncommon for the lords of that time to have many consorts, but Ieyasu's list of concubines was as big as a telephone book, and at one point he even had a child, his second son, with Tsukiyama's handmaiden. In contrast, Tokugawa Nobuyasu's marriage to Oda Nobunaga's eldest daughter, Tokihime, seems to have been relatively happy, despite reports that portray Nobuyasu as a rather unpleasant and unpopular man prone to anger and violence. The couple had 2 daughters together but no son, something that displeased Tsukiyama-dono, and who, like a proper meddling mother-in-law, made sure Tokihime knew it. She was adamant that a lord must have a son, and it was therefore her son's duty to find a woman capable of providing him with an heir. Nobuyasu, seeing the logic behind his mother's words, was easily convinced. Therefore, Lady Tsukiyama arranged for him to take as a concubine the daughter of a samurai who was a former retainer of Takeda Katsuyori, and who had been driven away from her home. Naturally, this created a deep divide between Tsukiyama and Tokihime. Alas, her plotting didn't stop there. Through a Chinese doctor called Genkei, she began exchanging correspondence with Katsuyori himself, asking him to attack Nobunaga and her own husband. Unbeknownst to her, however, one of her ladies-in-waiting was related to one of Tokihime's, both likely having been sent by Nobunaga to act as spies. She managed to discover the incriminating letters, which soon found their way to her daughter-in-law's hands and from there to the Oda clan's daimyo. While Tsukiyama-dono's involvement in the plot was undeniable, since this was her correspondence, it wasn't long before Nobuyasu's name was also implicated. But for that, Nobunaga would need further proof. This came in the form of Sake Tadetsugu's testimony, who, when visiting Nobunaga to deliver some horses as a gift from Ieyasu, was asked if Nobuyasu had anything to do with the plot. Tadetsugu, likely out of personal grudge against the man, did nothing to save his lord's eldest son, and instead confirmed that he indeed was part of the plot. With proof of the scheme's existence in the form of Lady Tsukiyama's letters and Tadetsugu's testimony, Nobunaga messaged Ieyasu, informing him of his traitorous son and wife, and asking for Nobuyasu to end his life immediately. Even to this day, we don't know if Nobuyasu was involved in the plot, or even if he had the faintest idea of what was going on, but by most accounts he was likely innocent. When Nobunaga's messenger reached Hamamatsu, Ieyasu was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he didn't want to sacrifice his eldest son, whom he had groomed as his heir and had shown great promise as a military commander. On the other hand, he had to think about the good of his clan as a whole, and for that he couldn't afford to lose his alliance with the Oda and incur Nobunaga's wrath. In the end, he placed the greater good over his son's life and ordered for Nobuyasu to be placed under house arrest, first in Ohama and later in Futamata, where at his father's order he would commit seppuku. Ieyasu sent 2 of his retainers, Hattori Hanzo and Amakata Michitsuna, to act as observers, with the latter also acting as the Kaishakunin, assisting Nobuyasu in his path to the next life. Although Nobunaga had probably not asked any such thing, Ieyasu would also order the death of his wife, who was guilty beyond any doubt, likely out of resentment for having cost him the life of his firstborn son. Therefore, one of Ieyasu's retainers was sent to Okazaki and took her head. A few days later, Nobuyasu followed his mother. While still mourning the death of his son, Ieyasu also continued his war with the Takeda. In the following year, Ieyasu prepared to recapture Taketenjin Castle, which Katsuyori had seized from him during his invasion of Mikawa in 1575. To this goal, he constructed 5 new castles around Taketenjin and renovated the old Ogasayama fort, effectively cutting off the castle from any possible assistance Katsuyori could offer. Despite repeated attempts by the castle's commander, Okabe Motonobu, to offer other castles in exchange for Taketenjin to be spared, the siege continued until March of 1581, when the starving garrison sallied out to meet a heroic end. It's not very hard to imagine that Katsuyori's inability to assist his own vassal during the siege did not earn him many sympathizers. The divide between him and his own retainers grew even larger, when in the same year he constructed a new castle at Shimbu, proclaimed it his new capital and moved in, forcing his retainers to follow him. This was a deviation from the clan's traditional strategy, as Shingen did not favor static defenses. Both his generals and his soldiers viewed it as a sign of weakness and lost confidence in his leadership. Another blow to Katsuyori's authority came in the first month of the following year, when Kiso Yoshinaka, lord of the Kiso Fukushima castle in Shinano, revolted against the Takeda. Katsuyori took the field to punish his rebellious vassal, but made little headway. That following month, a much bigger threat presented itself, as Nobunaga declared an all-out invasion of Takeda lands alongside his trustworthy allies Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Hojo of Odawara. As you may remember from our previous episode, the Hojo were traditionally allied to the Takeda until Shingen invaded Suruga and their political alliance was dismantled. Despite this, familial ties remained between the two families, as Katsuyori had taken Hojo Ujiyasu's daughter for his second wife, when his first wife and Nobunaga's adopted daughter, Toyama Fujin, died in childbirth. Still, Katsuyori made sure to drive a further wedge between his clan and the Hojo by supporting and allying himself with Uesugi Kagekatsu in 1579. Thus, by 1582, the Hojo had joined the long list of the people that wanted Katsuyori gone. The massive Oda-Tokugawa army marched through Takeda lands. They faced little opposition, as Katsuyori's vassals preferred to flee or surrender than to put up a fight. Even some of his relatives, like Anayama Baisetsu, who was his cousin, decided to throw their lot in with the enemy. For those who remained true and resisted, such as Katsuyori's younger brother, Nishina Morinobu, only death awaited. Morinobu was in charge of defending Taketo Castle, which came under siege by the forces of Oba Nobutada, Nobunaga's eldest son, who also acted as overall commander of the Oda troops in his father's absence. Nobutada offered to spare Morinobu's life, but the entire Taketo garrison fought to the last man. The fall of Taketo Castle led to the rest of the Takeda garrisons in Kai surrendering on sight. Meanwhile, Ieyasu himself made swift progress, capturing Kakigawa, Makino, Tanaka, Sumpu, and Manjudo in Kai. At the same time, the Hojo forces had reached Kai's eastern border. Katsuyori was trapped. Realizing his dire position, and knowing Shimpu's defenses were not strong enough to withstand a siege by such a large force, Katsuyori decided to flee the castle in early March, taking with him no more than 600 samurai and a few hundred women and children who were his kin. They first attempted to reach Iwadano Castle, whose lord, Oyamada Nobushige, had offered to shelter and help Katsuyori. But once they reached the mountain fort, Nobushige turned them away, having changed his mind and sided with Nobunaga. Without a stronghold, Katsuyori's party made its way towards the Tenmokuzan Seiyunji temple. However, their numbers were continuously dropping on the way, as his men abandoned their lord to save themselves. In the end, Katsuyori's force numbered no more than 100 souls, more than half women and children. Among them were Katsuyori's sons and his wife, who chose to stay by her husband's side, despite his plea for her to escape back to her family in Odawara. On the 11th of March, the Oda forces, possibly alerted by nearby villagers, pinpointed their position and began their attack. Katsuyori's men had nothing left to lose, and knowing certain death awaited them, they fought bravely, inflicting many casualties. But their fate was sealed, and those who didn't die by their enemies' blades took their own lives. Katsuyori and his eldest son, Nobukatsu, stood side by side, and one after the other, they committed seppuku. This was the tragic epilogue to Katsuyori's life, and the end of the main branch of the Takeda clan. In recognition for his support against the Takeda, Ieyasu received rulership of Suruga province, while Nobunaga took control of Kai and Shinano. However, the Oda warlord would not remain the ruler of these two provinces for long. A few months later, in June, he was betrayed by his own general, Akechi Mitsuhide, and would perish alongside his son Nobutada in Honnō-ji Temple, an incident you can learn more of by watching our video on Nobunaga. At that time, Ieyasu was also in the vicinity, albeit with only a handful of retainers accompanying him, as Nobunaga had invited him to a tour of Kansai to celebrate their victory over the Takeda. Ieyasu was staying at the port city of Sakai when word of Mitsuhide's betrayal got to him. He contemplated a direct attack on Mitsuhide with his small band of retainers to avenge Nobunaga's death. He even thought of committing seppuku to follow his senior ally and friend to the grave. Thankfully, however, he was persuaded by his men that it would be better to escape back to the safety of Mikawa, gather an army, and then avenge Nobunaga's death. The escape was not an easy one, as Mitsuhide's men were searching for them, and the area was filled with bandits. By bribing and at other times intimidating their adversaries, they managed to reach Iga province, where the knowledge of Hattori Hanzo, a native of Iga, came in handy. As many of the Igaji samurai were positively predisposed towards the Tokugawa clan, they helped Ieyasu and his party and safely escorted them to the port of Shirako,
where they boarded a merchant ship heading for the safety of Mikawa. Whether or not Tokugawa Ieyasu would have indeed avenged Nobunaga's death and punished Mitsuhide, we will never know. For one of Nobunaga's generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi moved faster than everyone else and crushed the Akechi forces at Yamazaki, not even 2 weeks after his lord's death. Using this triumph, Hideyoshi would later usurp control of the Oda clan, but Ieyasu himself was also presented with the ability to further his domain. The Uesugi and Hojo clans, informed of Nobunaga's passing, rushed to invade the Shinano and Kai provinces, triggering the Tensho Jingo War. Join us next time as we will see Ieyasu expanding his domain under the Toyotomi hegemony and, following Hideyoshi's death, becoming the most powerful man in Japan. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Unfortunately, even if you are a member or patron, you still have to press the bell button, otherwise YouTube will not send you notifications. Thank you very much for your kind support. It is because of this that we are able to produce so many videos and do our dream job. Don't forget to participate in the weekly polls to vote for the next exclusive video. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.